Welcome to the world of exploration. Welcome to the world of learning. Let's start exploring. Let's start learning. Today we are going to talk about the age of Milton or Puritan Age. It's also referred to as Puritan Age. The age of Milton is also referred to as Puritan Age. In the age of Milton, Puritanism grew as a moral and social force. Very important. Please underline it. Please highlight it. It's very important. Puritans were the ancestors of Wycliffe and Lollards. They had very strict opinions. Again, a keyword which needs to be highlighted. They had very strict opinions regarding life and behavior of people. The works of Puritan Age are mostly somber in character and nature. There is a sense of sadness, gloom, and pessimism, as there was political and religious confusion. So there is a sense of sadness, gloom, and pessimism, as there was a political and religious confusion. Very, very important. And King Charles I was also killed. And we are talking about the time when King Charles I was killed. So obviously gloom would be all pervasive, pessimism would be all pervasive, right? And therefore the religious and the political scenario would also get affected. This era is also known as the late Renaissance. And this era is also referred to as late Renaissance, not early but late Renaissance. Poetry was the main focus of this era. And what was the main focus of this era? Because we are talking about initial times, therefore prose and poetry were the only arenas of life that were, basically the center. So poetry was the main focus of this era, and the most contribution made in this period was by John Milton. And therefore when we talk about poetry, we basically, especially in this time period, we refer to John Milton. Milton was the last greatest poet of the Renaissance period. So Milton was the last great poet of the Renaissance period. He published many writings before 1660. These works include El Allegro, Il Penseroso, Comus, and Lycidas. There were other poets too. So please underline the names, as you need to remember the names. There were other poets too, the metaphysical poets and cavalier poets. The metaphysical poets were the people of learning. When we talk about, or when we say metaphysical poets, they were the people who were actually learned. These poets include John Donne, and these poets include John Donne, George Herbert, Richard Crashaw, Andrew Marvell, Thomas Trahan, Henry Vaughan, and others. The Cavalier poets were supporters of King Charles I. Now, when we talk about the Cavalier poets, what do we actually mean by Cavalier poets? They were supporters of King Charles I. So they were actually supporting King Charles I. During the English Civil War. Very important time period. These poets include Robert Herrick, Richard Lovelace, Thomas Carew, and Sir John Suckling. Cavalier poets used classical and allegory allusions. Now, Cavalier poets use classical and allegory allusions. We are talking about Cavalier poets. Roman authors like Horace, Cicero, and Ovid influenced these poets, and Roman Um, from where did the influence come? It came from Roman authors like Horace, Cicero, and Ovid. They were responsible for influencing the Cavalier poets, which actually made use of classical and allegoric allusions. Metaphysical poetry was spiritual. Metaphysical poets wrote poetry with far-fetched or unusual similes or metaphors. The famous works of Age of Milton include songs and sonnets, and therefore the famous works of Age of Milton include songs and sonnets. The Hesperides and Noble Numbers, the Sun and the Sun Rising, Cholesterol, Tetrachorodon are all examples of such songs and sonnets. How they wrote songs and sonnets. Then we move on to the Age of Dryden. Now, coming on to the Age of Dryden, which lasted from 1660 and lasted till 1700. The second name of Age of Dryden is the Restoration Age. So we also refer to as the Age of Dryden. We also refer to as the Age of Restoration, because of the restoration of monarchy in England. And why do we say so? We say so because we are talking about the restoration of monarchy in England. Restoration of what in England? Of monarchy, of the rule, right? This era started when Charles II returned to the throne. So this era started, when did this era start? It started when Charles II, we are talking about Charles II now, returned to the throne, returned to the power, right? When he had got the power. Because people had spent a lot of time restricted in Puritan period. And when we talk about the Puritan period, we are talking about the restrictions that were imposed on people and their behavior, right? As I have mentioned before as well, that there were restrictions that were put on the behavior and on people. So we are especially after that period, after that Puritan period, after that particular period. Now it was King Charles II reign, right? Now King Charles II had come to the throne, had returned to the throne. So because people had spent a lot of time restricted in Puritan period, after it there was an immense reaction against it. After that there was an immense reaction that was against it, that people now were feeling as if they have been shackled, they have been chained by the society, right? So moderation and decency started dissipating. Now moderation, because people earlier used to be doing everything in moderation and decency was the norm. So now moderation and decency started dissipating. Faithlessness, betrayal and recklessness became fashionable. Now what had become the norm was that now earlier faithfulness was seen to be a kind of a crucial trait, but now faithlessness, betrayal and recklessness became fashionable, right? So this was kept at the center. Then, and the people who still had some goodness were laughed at, and people who still possessed some goodness, who showed the signs of virtues, were laughed at. They were made fun of. All of this had a definite impact on literature of the Restoration era. So all of this, the entire summary of what I just summed up, had its definite impact on the literature of Restoration era. Now we move on to literature, how literature became intellectual rather than imaginative or emotional. So literature became intellectual rather than imaginative or emotional. Very important, please underline it. That literature became intellectual rather than imaginative or emotional. Though it was often brilliant, it was a bit hard and insensitive. Even poetry became prosaic and was lacking imagination. Now, what was the major trait? The major trait being that poetry now lacked imagination. It became more prosaic in nature. So, what were the two things that actually marked or were seen as a sign? Prose and poetry were seen as a sign in initial days. So now even poetry became prosaic and was lacking in imagination. Examples of which include Sodom from Earl of Rochester, The Country Wife by William Wycherley, True Treatises on Government by Locke, etc. Apart from this, there were still people like Dryden who saved this era. Dryden was the main influential poet. So Dryden was the main influential poet, literary critic, translator, and playwright who represented this period. So he was the one who represented this period, being influential poet, being a literary critic, being a translator, being a playwright. He actually represented this particular period. His most prominent work is the mock heroic Mac Flecknoe. Clear? So this is one of his most influential work. More works from him include the two great doctrinal poems, Religio Late and the Hind, and the Panther, Love Triumphant or Nature Will Prevail, The Wild Gallant, etc. Other notable writers from this time are John Bunyan, Edmund Waller, Sir John Denham, Samuel Butler, Jeremy Collier, John Gay, and others. Prominent works from this time include Hudibras, The Wild Gallant, Grace Abounding, The Pilgrim's Progress, The Life and Death of Mr. Badman, The Holy War, etc. John Milton published his most appreciated piece of writing, Paradise Lost, during this era. As we know, the start of novel writing was also during this era. The start of novel writing was also seen in this era. Elphra Ben, the female author of Oronoco, is considered to be the first novelist in England. So Elphra Ben, the female author of Oronoco, is considered to be the first novelist in England. In the next session, we will be moving on to the age of Pope or Augustan literature, which is also referred to as the Augustan literature.